I was brushing my teeth when my wife suddenly screamed from the driveway, like she'd just spotted a live rattlesnake in the glove compartment. Still foaming at the mouth with my toothbrush in hand, I rushed outside in my pajamas and there it was, a tow truck slowly backing up toward her Jeep. It wasn't parked illegally or in the wrong spot, it was just sitting perfectly fine in our own driveway, on our own property. Standing beside the tow truck was Karen, the HOA president, decked out in a reflective vest, waving a clipboard like a traffic baton, and shouting into her phone. Leah was standing in front of the driver, blocking the truck, yelling, "This is my car, what are you doing?" Karen looked right at me and said, "It's being repossessed according to HOA Article 7. Repossessed." I almost choked on my minty toothpaste foam. Not towed, not ticketed or repossessed. I was stunned, momentarily speechless. What Karen didn't realize and what made the whole thing so ridiculously absurd was that we still owned that Jeep. Technically, it was part of the dealership's inventory since Leah and I owned the dealership it came from. Leah's eyes were blazing with anger, but she kept her cool enough to hold her phone up to the tow truck driver, who was starting to look uneasy. "This is private property. That vehicle belongs to us. If you touch it, I swear I'll sue your company for every bolt on that old rust bucket." The tow driver hesitated. Karen waved her clipboard and said, "Proceed with the order. It's illegal under HOA rules." The driver looked between them, clearly realizing he landed smack in the middle of a suburban showdown he never signed up for. Meanwhile, I was trying not to laugh and shout at the same time. I didn't want to blow our cover too soon. Karen was the type of person who believed authority came from shouting loudly and wielding a clipboard. From past experience, I knew she never actually read the law she liked to throw around, and that made what happened next even better. Just a day before, Leah had decided to rotate one of our promotional vehicles from the dealership's inventory. She'd picked a brand new Jeep Wrangler Rubicon, black on black, with huge tires and premium tint. Technically, it was still dealership stock, it just registered under our executive demo program, which meant we had full legal ownership until it was finally sold. That morning, Karen had slapped a violation sticker on it, claiming it broke neighborhood rules about vehicle modifications. Leah had laughed it off, but now, Karen had gone full-on psycho and called in a third-party tow, insisting it was an unauthorized vehicle. Leah had tried to explain calmly that the HOA had no jurisdiction over vehicles parked on their owner's driveway, especially since the property line extended beyond the sidewalk. Karen threatened to file a lien if we didn't remove the Jeep from our own property. What she didn't realize was that we were ready for this. This wasn't our first run-in with Karen. For months, she'd harassed us over everything from the size of our mailbox to the exact shade of mulch Leah used in the flower beds. But this was a whole new level of ridiculous. I grabbed my phone and called our dealership manager, Dave, who happened to be in town and had a flair for the dramatic. I told him to bring the title folder, a press kit, and the giant 7-foot promotional Jeep balloon we usually put on rooftops for events. If Karen wanted a spectacle, we'd give her a full-blown show. While we waited, I tried to stall the tow driver, who was now clearly regretting his route that morning. I offered him a donut and asked if he wanted to check the registration. He glanced over at Karen, who was now deep in conversation with someone she claimed was the regional compliance officer, probably just her book club friend, Barb. I pulled the driver aside and quietly said, "That Jeep belongs to the dealership. It's executive inventory. If you touch it, that's felony theft." He blinked in surprise. "Dealership?" I nodded. "I own the dealership. That Jeep is mine." His eyes widened. "Her name's not on any paperwork." He took a step back. Karen noticed and stormed over, furious that her power play was falling apart. "You have no authority here," she snapped at me. "This is an HOA issue. It's non-compliant, oversized wheels, window tint, custom decals. It looks like a gangster vehicle. My neighbors have rights." I nearly laughed out loud. A gangster vehicle? That Jeep was cleaner than a surgical room and newer than her acrylic nails. I just smiled and said, "Actually, that's a promotional unit on loan from our showroom. We own 7 just like it." She looked confused, then annoyed, then dismissive. "You're bluffing." And that's when Dave showed up with a broken bar. Dave showed up wearing oversized Ram dealership tags, a sharp suit, dark sunglasses, and carrying a huge cardboard box. He stepped out like a lawyer entering the courtroom. "Morning, folks," he said, handing Karen a folder. "Here's the title, illegal proof of ownership. This Jeep is registered to our dealership. And here's a cease and desist letter from our legal team. If you try to tow this vehicle again, you'll be charged with attempted theft and HOA overreach." Karen just stood there blinking. Dave continued, "Also, for our records, I brought a promotional banner." He opened the box and pulled out a massive sign that read, "Meet our newest off-road star, available now at Briarwood Motors," featuring a cartoon Jeep flying over a mountain and Leah's name on a tag labeled Executive Demo. Leah burst out laughing. The tow driver gave a thumbs up and started packing up. Karen sputtered something about unauthorized advertising, then stormed back inside, fuming like a toddler who'd lost her juice box. But the battle wasn't over. As Dave packed up, he looked at me and said, "You know she's going to try something worse now, right?" I nodded. This was just the opening salvo. Karen never accepted public humiliation quietly. The Jeep incident was only going to fuel her fiery, but this time, we were ready. That evening, Leah and I sat on the porch with coffee, plotting our next move. We both knew Karen wouldn't stop until either our Jeep was gone or we were blacklisted from the HOA. She'd dig into bylaws, invent violations, and harass us through every official channel. What she didn't know was that we'd been quietly gathering evidence, photos, emails, security footage, HOA board recordings, and even a tip from a former board member who hinted Karen had some skeletons hidden away. As the sun set and the Jeep gleamed in the driveway, I turned to Leah and said, "She thinks this is about the Jeep, but she has no idea what she just set in motion." And just like that, the war began, and not over a car, but over power, entitlement, and the illusion of control. Karen had picked the wrong family to mess with. Soon, the entire neighborhood would know why. The morning after the tow truck incident, the neighborhood was buzzing. Leah and I couldn't take a walk without being stopped by someone asking, "Did she really try to repossess your Jeep? Or I heard she called it gang-affiliated. Is that true?" Word spread fast, and Karen's brazen stunt had officially crossed the HOA gossip threshold into legendary territory. But the real issue wasn't what she had done, it was what she was planning next. Karen wasn't the type to back down in shame. No, she was regrouping, rewriting the story, and preparing to strike back, wrapped in a policy manual. We didn't have to wait long. That same afternoon, a letter appeared taped to our front door, sealed with the HOA insignia. Leah tore it open and read it aloud with dramatic flair. It was an official notice of non-compliance citing violations under Section 9 of the HOA Guidelines. Alleged infractions included vehicle aesthetics inconsistent with community standards, potential commercial use of property, and unregistered business activity. I rolled my eyes so hard I nearly sprained something. Karen had escalated from vehicle harassment to accusing us of running a dealership out of our driveway. That accusation wasn't just ridiculous, it was calculated. Karen knew the law well enough to toe the line. If she could convince the board we were conducting business on residential property, she might spark zoning violations or even city fines. Leah handed me the letter with a frustrated snort and said, "She really thinks she's dealing with amateurs." That night, we sat down and began constructing a timeline. Every incident, every email, every note from Karina organized and cataloged. It wasn't just about defending ourselves anymore, we were preparing a full-scale counterattack. The next day, I decided to dig into the HOA's meeting records. Karen had been president for nearly 3 years, and her tenure was marked by sudden rule changes, unexplained fees, and an uncanny knack for making people feel like criminals for existing. I filed a formal request to access the HOA meeting minutes. Under state law, as a homeowner, I had the right to review any non-confidential board proceedings. Of course, Karen tried to delay me. She replied by email, claiming a 2 to 3 week backlog. That made me laugh. Backlog? There were only 57 homes in our development, and I knew for a fact. I knew the board met monthly, usually with no more than 6 people showing up, half of them Karen's poker buddies. When I finally got hold of the meeting documents, thanks to a firm but polite letter from our attorney, everything I suspected was confirmed. In just the past year, Karen had pushed through a series of changes to the HOA handbook under the vague banner of community enhancement clauses. These changes gave the HOA the power to issue aesthetic violation warnings, control driveway usage if more than 3 vehicles were parked, and impose temporary restrictions on vehicles that didn't fit the standard look. In reality, these were just loopholes Karen wrote to harass residents under the pretense of policy enforcement. The most shocking thing? These rules were passed through emergency board votes Karen had signed off on herself without the full board's approval. At least 3 board members were missing from every vote. I double-checked the roster and noticed something else strange. 2 members listed hadn't lived in the neighborhood for months, yet their names were still being used to meet quorum requirements. After checking public records, I confirmed both homes had new owners. Karen had been forging board compliance using outdated signatures. Leah and I decided to track down one of the former board members, a woman named Jill who now lived a few miles away. We brought coffee and laid out what we'd found. Jill wasn't shocked. In fact, she seemed relieved. She told us Karen pressured her to sign blank forms during her final weeks on the board, supposedly to speed up minor rule clarifications. Jill admitted she'd been uneasy about Karen's tactics for years, especially her connection to a local mechanic who conveniently towed all the so-called non-compliant vehicles to his shop and then charged outrageous storage fees. There were even whispers Karen accepted cash gifts or discounts in exchange for steering business that way. That mechanic's name rang a bell. I'd seen it on the side of the tow truck a few days earlier. It was a small, mom-and-pop garage on the edge of town called Kenny's Auto Recovery. The place should have been barely scraping by on jump starts and fender repairs, but somehow, it always had a shiny new tow truck parked out front. We decided to visit Kenny just to observe. Pulling into the gravel lot, I immediately noticed something off. Behind the shop, in a fenced area, were at least 8 vehicles. Some still had HOA violation stickers on their windows. A few showed visible damage from rough towing. There was an old classic Mustang, a modified Bronco, and several trucks and SUVs with off-road tires like Leah's Jeep. I walked into the office and pretended to be a customer. Kenny, a stocky man with greasy hands and a worn cap, greeted me with zero enthusiasm. I mentioned my cousin's car had been tagged by the HOA and he was worried about it being towed. Without missing a beat, Kenny said, "Tell him to keep it off the street. I know the lady who runs the place. She's strict." I played dumb and asked if he dealt with HOAs a lot. He nodded proudly. "Got an exclusive hookup with Briarview Estates. Lady President's real sharp, sends me when needed." That was all I needed to hear. He just admitted to an unofficial arrangement with Karen. I thanked him, left, and returned to the car where Leah had been secretly recording the conversation over the open Bluetooth connection. She smiled when I got in. "Got it all," she said. "He even bragged about towing that old Bronco from Lot 16. That Bronco belonged to Brent, another neighbor who had complained about Karen's constant harassment. Brent had been mysteriously fined twice in 1 month for non-uniform paint, even though his house looked just like half the others in the neighborhood. Now we had a possible pattern. Karen was selectively targeting homeowners with customized or expensive vehicles. She issued warnings under her bogus HOA amendments, then arranged for their cars to be towed to Kenny's, where owners faced steep fees or risked losing their vehicles altogether. Kenny profited, Karen probably got kickbacks, and nobody had dared to challenge the AMA until now. With audio recordings, home meeting minutes, legal paperwork, and first-hand testimony, our case was becoming airtight. Back home, we spread all the evidence across the kitchen table. Leah stared at the mountain of proof and said, "She thinks this is about aesthetics, but this is fraud. This is theft disguised with paperwork." I nodded slowly. We weren't just aiming to clear our name as we were ready to expose Karen's whole little scheme, publicly, legally, and with enough flair to make sure she never forgot the day she messed with the family that owned the very Jeep she tried to steal. Karen wasn't just out of her depth anymore, she was drowning in her own arrogance, and she had no clue the tide was coming in fast. By the time the weekend arrived, the atmosphere in the neighborhood felt heavy. Karen's blinds stayed shut tight, which was unusual for someone who usually peeked out every 10 minutes like a hawk in yoga pants. Leah and I weren't surprised. Our quiet evidence collection had grown into a full-blown dossier thicker than most HOA handbooks. We had the home meeting minutes with questionable signatures, Kenny's audio admitting to a shady deal, a list of wrongfully towed vehicles, and neighbors slowly gathering courage to speak out. Still, we knew our next move had to be precising not just facts, but strategy. Because Karen wasn't just a bad neighbor, she was running a racket weaponizing the community's trust for her own gain. Monday morning, Leah and I sat at the dealership's conference table, sipping coffee and reviewing every page of documentation. Dave, our general manager, joined us with his laptop, fully focused. The dealership wasn't just a business, it was a family legacy. Leah's father built it from scratch, and we were fiercely protective of our name, especially against something as petty and unfair as Karen's antics. Dave leaned back and said, "I think it's time we throw her off her game. Let's hit her where she's not looking at public perception." He was right. Karen built her HOA power on the illusion of respectability. She projected authority with a smug smirk, clipboard in hand, an air of superiority most people never challenged. But that was about to change. That very afternoon, we launched the first phase. The dealership issued a press release, no names, of course, about a troubling incident involving an HOA attempting to wrongfully seize dealership-owned inventory from private property. It detailed improper towing practices, bogus HOA amendments, and urged residents to check their rights under state property laws. We attached a photo of the promotional Jeep, minus the license plate, with the tagline, "Know who owns what before you tow." The press release caught the attention of a local auto blogger, and soon after, a community radio host invited me for a 5-minute interview. I kept my tone neutral but highlighted the dangers of power-hungry HOAs overstepping legal bounds and what that meant for residents' rights. The community noticed. At the grocery store, I overheard people chatting about it by the frozen peas. At school drop-off, 2 dads in front of me chuckled about the Jeep lady. Slowly but surely, the fear Karen had worked so hard to instill was starting to break down because people weren't just hearing about her abuses, they were seeing her exposed. Back at the dealership, we prepared our legal strategy. Dave printed copies of the Jeep's title, insurance, registration, and corporate ownership papers. We reached out to our legal team to draft an official complaint against the HOA, naming Karen specifically for interfering with private property without due process. What made our case especially strong was that the Jeep was registered to the dealership. Karen had tried to remove corporate inventory from residential land, a move that escalated the issue to commercial interference. Our lawyers called it a dream case. For us, it was personal. Meanwhile, Karen was scrambling. A neighbor named Todd, usually neutral, showed us a flyer Karen had left on his porch. It read, "Neighborhood in danger, commercial operations spreading. HOA guidelines must be respected." No specifics, just vague fear-mongering, a panic move to shift attention away from her and onto us. Todd just shrugged. "You guys are the only ones who plow your sidewalks in winter and host the summer barbecue. I trust you more than some note in Comic Sans." Karen still wasn't backing down. She called a special home meeting to be held the next Saturday at the community clubhouse. It was supposedly to address neighborhood violations, but we knew it would be a kangaroo court with us as the targets. Leah smiled when she saw the announcement. Taped to the mailbox was a flyer Karen clearly thought we'd walk in scared. Leah scoffed. "She has no idea we're bringing reinforcements." And bring them we did. Saturday arrived, and Leah and I showed up early at the clubhouse, accompanied by Dave, our attorney, and a USB loaded with documentation, timestamps, recordings, and a high-resolution scan of Karen's forged board signatures. Karen was already there, pacing in front of a projector screen, running through slides titled Community Standards Enforcement and Danger of Non-Compliance. She looked up and visibly tensed when she saw us walk in with our team. Neighbors trickled in one by one, some curious, some skeptical, most just hungry for weekend drama. Karen kicked off the meeting with a fake smile, welcoming everyone and thanking them for their dedication to preserving the dignity of our community. Then she clicked through her presentation, which included a close-up photo of our Jeep, with captions like over-commercialization of residential spaces and preserving suburban integrity. That's when our lawyer stood up calmly and asked for a moment to respond. Karen snapped, "This isn't a legal proceeding, it's a neighborhood conversation." But the room shifted. Someone from the back called out, "Then why call it an assembly and send official notices?" Karen faltered briefly, then pressed on. But Dave wasn't backing down. He held up a printed copy of the Jeep's title and said, "This vehicle is corporate property. Your attempt to remove it constitutes interference with commercial assets on private land. This isn't just overreach, it's potentially criminal." Gasps filled the room. Karen's composure started to crumble. "They're twisting everything," she cried. "They're running a dealership out of their home." Dave stood firm. "Actually, we're not. But even if we were, that wouldn't justify your forgery." He handed out packets to the audience, home meeting minutes, missing signatures, and highlighted dates that contradicted Karen's claims. Jill, the former board member, stood and spoke, revealing how Karen pressured her to sign blank forms and bypass proper votes. That was the turning point. The room shifted. Even Karen's usual allies looked uneasy. An older couple stood and asked how many others had their vehicles unfairly towed. 3 hands went up, then 5. A woman tearfully shared how her son's truck was towed just days before he left for college, costing nearly $1,000 in fees. Kenny's garage was mentioned. So was the word kickbacks. Karen backed up against the podium as if it might shield her from the truth. The attorney calmly announced that a formal complaint had been filed with the county about misuse of HOA funds, illegal rule changes, and suspected fraud. He added that if any further retaliation occurred, additional civil and criminal charges would follow. Karen muttered something about legal harassment, then stormed out the side door, leaving behind her half-finished slideshow and the ruins of her authority. What followed surprised everyone. Neighbors began really talking for the first time in years without fearing HOA retaliation. They shared stories, frustrations, and even jokes about Karen's infamous yardstick she used to measure grass height. Someone suggested forming a temporary board until new elections could be held. Leah was nominated by 3 different people before she even said a word. I couldn't help but laugh as the woman once threatened over a Jeep was now being asked to lead the very HOA that tried to bulldoze her dignity. As we left the clubhouse that evening, the sky glowed soft orange. Leah looked at the Jeep and said, "We should name her." I smiled. "I think she's already earned it." We settled on just Isia because this wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about standing up to those who think power gives them the right to trample others. Thanks to a clipboard-happy Karen and one very determined wife, our little community had been reminded what real leadership looks like. Karen may have stormed out of the meeting, but the storm she left behind was just beginning. Her exit was meant to be a show of indignation, but really, it was her retreat. The neighbors had seen the truth in broad daylight, projected on screens, printed in packets, spoken aloud by witnesses who had stayed silent far too long. Her ironclad grip on the neighborhood built on fear and passive-aggressive finesse had cracked. But Leah and I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Karen wasn't the type to vanish quietly. She would lick her wounds, regroup, and come back louder, sneakier, and more desperate. True to form, it only took 2 days. A certified letter arrived, addressed to Leah. The envelope bore the HOA logo, but the return address was a private law office downtown and not the usual P.O. box. Leah opened it with a calm I envied, scanning the neatly typed contents line by line. Her face didn't change yet, but when she passed the letter to me, her eyes glittered with a mix of rage and amusement. Karen had hired a private attorney. She was now claiming Leah's Jeep violated zoning ordinances by advertising a commercial business in a residential area. Her evidence? The dealership tag and a small rear window sticker that read Briarwood Motors Executive Loaner, which she said was unlawful. The letter claimed that the Jeep's signage violated neighborhood rules banning commercial displays. According to Karen, the Jeep was basically an illegal billboard. The absurdity almost made me laugh, but Leah just shook her head and said, "She's trying to bleed us dry with bureaucracy, one letter at a time." I understood exactly what she meant. Karen had realized she couldn't win by force, so now she was switching tactics to legal attrition, hoping we'd get tired, spend money, and eventually give up. But Karen had miscalculated once more. She thought we were just car people. She didn't know Leah had a minor-in-law and a stubborn streak forged in courtroom battles, thanks to years spent helping her father settle dealership disputes across 3 counties. Leah drafted a response with surgical precision. We denied every allegation and cited statutes clearly stating that as long as a vehicle is legally registered and parked on private property, any incidental branding falls under personal freedom of expression. We also attached state legal precedents and referenced 2 prior HOA cases where attempts to limit vehicle-based advertising were struck down. Leah ended the letter with a line that made me proud. Any continued harassment will be treated as malicious abuse of process, and legal damages will be sought accordingly. But we didn't stop there. Karen had opened the floodgates and we had more than enough evidence to fight back. We filed a formal complaint with the Department of Community Affairs, attaching all our documents, meeting recordings, and affidavits. The complaint detailed misuse of authority, fraudulent amendments to HOA bylaws, possible collusion with a third-party towing company, and financial mismanagement of dues. It was the kind of report that would trigger an audit and likely strip Karen of any remaining power. Just when it felt like we'd reached peak chaos, fate threw in one more twist. A neighbor we'll barely know, Mr. Alvarez, a quiet man who lived in the corner house with a perfectly trimmed bonsai gardenia, showed up at our door carrying a plastic tote full of papers. He explained he'd been the HOA treasurer 2 years earlier but left after a falling out with Karen. He'd held onto records, unsure if he'd ever need them, but after seeing what was happening, he figured the time had come. We brought the tote inside, and what we found nearly made Leah drop her coffee. Among the folders were bank statements, check copies, and HOA reimbursement requests signed by Karen for expenses that made no sense. There were payments labeled beautification projecta which matched exactly with the dates her backyard landscaping was redone. Another charge marked sign replacement lined up perfectly with a delivery receipt from a company specializing in decorative home plaques, one of which hung above her garage. There was even a reimbursement for vehicle operations consultation from 3 months prior, right when she first tried to tow our Jeep. In plain terms, Karen had been using HOA funds to pay for her own upgrades and her crusade against us. Leah carefully scanned everything into digital files and sent it to our attorney, who practically salivated at the potential charges: embezzlement, misuse of HOA funds, fraud. This was no longer petty HOA drama. This was criminal territory. The legal letter that followed was sharp and direct. We informed Karen we had obtained financial records showing clear misconduct and that a civil suit was imminent. We offered her only and only option: full resignation from the HOA board, repayment of misappropriated funds, and a written apology to the community. She had 72 hours to respond. During those 3 days, the neighborhood held its breath. Karen's house was unusually quiet, her porch was bare, and her car was nowhere to be seen. On the second night, someone anonymously posted in the community Facebook group asking if it was true that the HOA president had been stealing money. Within hours, comments exploded. Brenda, the guy whose Bronco was Toyota, came forward with screenshots of emails Karen had sent him. Another neighbor uploaded a photo of her SUV being towed by Kenny's truck, captioned, "Guess who signed off?" It wasn't just a few voices anymore, it was the entire community. On the third morning, a courier delivered an envelope. It was Karen's resignation letter typed and signed, with no apology, no explanation, just a cold, clinical withdrawal from all HOA activities, effective immediately. She blamed stress. Karen accused us of spreading misinformation and running a toxic character assassination campaign. The irony wasn't lost on any. She had built her entire identity around controlling the narrative. Yet now she was being ousted by the very community she'd bullied into silence. The neighborhood called an emergency meeting the following week. This time, there were no theatrics, no power plays, no clipboards, and just residents wanting peace. The interim board unanimously voted to launch an internal audit of all HOA finances. Leah was officially elected to the board by unanimous vote, and within days, she introduced new rules mandating financial transparency, public board votes, and term limits. Those same neighbors who once flinched at Karen's glare were now sharing ideas, shaking hands, and greeting each other warmly. That night, Leah and I parked the Jeep, Justice, right in the middle of the cul-de-sac for a celebratory photo. Neighbors gathered with snacks, drinks, and plenty of Karen stories. Dave even brought the inflatable Jeep balloon from the dealership and tied it to a mailbox just for fun. Someone played music, another suggested making it an annual tradition, and so Jeep Night was born. It was silly, it was spontaneous, but it felt like everything Karen had tried to suppress was finally breaking free. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops, bathing the street in warm orange light, Leah leaned against the Jeep and said, "She tried to take this from USA, not just the car, but the peace, the joy." I nodded, watching neighbors laugh, chat, and swap stories. "And now she can't take anything," I replied. "Not even our parking spot." Because it was never about the Jeep, it was about standing up to someone who thought power meant control. And now, that power had shifted, not by force, but through unity, truth, and one very determined executive demo on oversized tires. 3 weeks after Karen's resignation, the neighborhood felt transformed. There was a calm that hadn't been there in years, as if a tight wire had finally snapped, releasing everyone from its grip. Front lawns were a little less manicured, kids played in driveways without fear, and neighbors actually talked instead of retreating at the sight of a clipboard. And parked proudly in our driveway, like a trophy of war, sat the same Jeep Karen had once tried to repossess, still spotless, still bold, still ours under the dealership's corporate account. No one dared challenge it now. Leah wasted no time in her new HOA role. Her first act was to launch a full forensic audit of all HOA finances over the past 3 years. With the help of Mr. Alvarez and a local CPA, they examined every receipt, reimbursement, and expense authorization that had passed through Karen's hands. What they uncovered confirmed what we suspected and revealed even more. Karen had not only used HOA funds for her landscaping and personal signage, but had also funneled small payments into fake vendor accounts, including one called K Green Compliance Consulting, which conveniently shared a P.O. box with her nephew's defunct LLC. The audit triggered a secondary investigation by the County Housing Authority, which had received our complaint and now had enough evidence to launch a formal probe into financial misconduct. Karen was served notice once again, this time by an officer carrying a file labeled Civil Liability Inquiry. She was officially under investigation for embezzlement, with potential wire fraud charges depending on how funds moved between accounts. Leah didn't smile at the news. "It was never personal," she said. "She made it personal, and that, more than anything, defined the quiet power Leah now held." We decided to go a step further, and not for revenge, but for community healing. Our dealership launched a new campaign called Drive with Dignity, offering discounts to residents in neighborhoods with overreaching HOAs who could show documentation of unfair fines, citations, or towing attempts. What we thought would be a small goodwill gesture blew up. Within 5 days, the story went viral. A regional news station picked it up with the headline, "Jeep Owners Fight Back, Dealership Battles HOA Bullies with Justice and Four-Wheel Drive." The segment featured footage from our home meeting, a brief interview with Leah, and a shot of the Jeep parked out front with a giant red bow on top. From there, things took off. We started receiving calls from reporters, community blogs, and even a podcast focused on HOA reform nationwide. Leah did 2 interviews in a week, sharing her story and urging homeowners to read their HOA agreements carefully, challenge unlawful amendments, and never back down just because someone carried a clipboard. She didn't rant or gloat. She spoke plainly, logically, and with a quiet fire that made her message resonate. Even more powerful was Leah's calm strength. While Karen scrambled to rewrite her role in the saga, anonymous letters started appearing in several neighbors' mailboxes, all typed in bold caps with phrases like "they're lying for publicity" and "I was trying to protect the community." One neighbor even reported seeing Karen late at night, slipping envelopes into mail slots, wearing sunglasses and a hoodie, an image so absurd nobody took her seriously anymore. Her credibility had been utterly destroyed by her own actions. She became a neighborhood cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked. Meanwhile, the culture of the HOA began to change. Leah implemented a resident suggestion box and formed a rotating committee of volunteers to review neighborhood proposals. People started participating in ways they never dared before. Brenda, the guy whose Bronco had been towed, helped organize a casual weekend car meet in the cul-de-sac, just a friendly gathering to showcase the unique vehicles neighbors owned. No one batted an eye at decals or tire size. Kids climbed inside Jeeps, dads compared engine mods, and even some of the older residents brought lawn chairs just to enjoy the scene. One of the most touching moments came when Mrs. Whitaker, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built, approached Leah with tears in her eyes. She shared how Karen once threatened to fine her for letting her granddaughter draw chalk art on the sidewalk. "I scrubbed it off that same night," she said. "I didn't want to be a problem, but I hated having to erase her joy." Leah hugged her and promised, "You'll never have to erase joy again." Then came the cherry on top. At our next dealership promotional event, we unveiled a special edition Jeep as a tongue-in-cheek tribute to everything that had happened. It was an off-road beast with matte black paint, custom mud tires, a subtle Justice Edition logo near the bumper, and a decal that read "Not for Care Use." We posted a teaser online expecting a few laughs. Instead, it went semi-viral. Hundreds commented, shared their own horror stories, and asked how they could get one. Corporate quickly approved a limited run, and just like that, what began as a suburban battle turned into a regional product line. But for all the jokes, headlines, and campaign success, the best moment came quietly. One night after dinner, Leah and I sat in the driveway watching the sunset paint the sky in burnt orange and dusty purple. The Jeep sat beside USA, the same one Karen tried to drag away like it was a stray animal. I looked at Leah and asked, "Do you think she ever understood what she was really trying to take from us?" Leah paused, then said, "I think she believed it was about control. But it was really about respect. And when you try to steal someone's dignity and wrap it in rules, you don't just lose the battle, you lose your seat at the table." A few nights later, a moving truck pulled up in front of Karen's house. There was no announcement, no farewell, no sign of her stepping outside, just movers packing up furniture, boxed frames, and carefully rolling up an expensive-looking rug. By morning, the house was empty, and a for sale sign went up within the week. The neighborhood exhaled, and nobody missed her. In her place, peace bloomed, and not the fake kind born from submission, but the earned kind that grows when people work together instead of under fear, the kind that fills driveways with laughter, chalk art, and Jeeps that don't need permission to exist, the kind that doesn't tremble at a notice or a threat because it remembers what it took to get here and who stood up when it mattered. We never set out to become symbols of resistance. We were just a couple trying to enjoy our driveway. But Karen's biggest mistake was assuming we'd fold like everyone else. She didn't realize we weren't just parked there, we were planted, and no one, no matter how many policies they twisted, could ever uproot us again. Justice wasn't just the name of a Jeep.